While the common perception is that Bollywood films allow you to tune off your mind and just enjoy the movie, there are some directors who put a lot of effort into telling the story. They use different elements of filmmaking such as cinematography, creative use of lighting, ambitious camera work, symbolism to make sure their story is the best it can be. For example, Zoya Akhtar uses mirrors to talk about themes such as class divide and internal conflict in her films. But for this video, I want to talk about how Sanjay Leela Bhansali uses color and settings to amplify the emotions of his characters and push forth the message of the film. Since the 1940s, color has been jumping out at us on screen, and Bhansali makes use of three important aspects of color theory: hue, saturation, and brightness.
Sanjay Leela Bhansali's use of color is one of the many elements in a larger matrix. He uses what I call emotional furniture in his movies. Objects seem to get the same emotions as the characters. They appear to be an extension of the character's state of mind and heart.
Bhansali has a wide list of films to his credit, so I've picked some of the most popular ones to dissect, starting with Black, that Bhansali makes great use of brightness and darkness to tell the story.
In his film Black, the typewriter stands for the lead character's perseverance. This trait is also reflected in the color coding. Michelle McNally's world is dark and filled with shadows to emphasize her blindness and her struggle with her condition.
When he wants to introduce, even in the opening shots of the film, you have it entirely in darkness, and then you just have the title sort of emerging. And then when you have your first introduction to her, she's seated in a room that's predominantly dark with just light streaming out of the windows in like layers. The screen actually stays dark for a good 2 minutes or so. Emphasize what it means to live in darkness. How long can you stay in darkness? Because he's trying to get us to understand the story on many levels.
Film like Devdas, red is a recurring motif. It's the shade of the vermilion that prevents Devdas from reuniting with his first love, Paro. Paro frequently wears red saris or white saris with distinctive red borders.
When we look at Devdas, we see how Bhansali uses color and setting to discuss class divide and marriage, but also how he uses houses to tell his story.
Their house is this, centuries old Haveli, which has been there forever. It's old wealth. And Paro's house is this newer building, grander, slightly more garish, in the sense that you have stained glass, which may have been a more modern dressing up the windows as compared to, say, how Devdas's mansion looks. What I've noticed about Bhansali is that, especially when you start off with his first film itself, he was probably working with a much smaller budget and things like that. So he uses a more natural setting over there.
Khamoshi is set in Goa, which is shot to resemble a European coastal town. It's a very simple film, straightforward in its storytelling, not too over the top, not too melodramatic.
In Khamoshi, you're looking at the idea of a girl with the responsibility of her parents. She is someone who knows she's duty bound, and yet at the same time there is this wonderful romance that's waiting for her, and how she sort of has to engage with all of that. When you look at the opening shots of the film itself, he starts off with these images from like the fishing life, the life of people living along the coast. It's simple, and sort of he tries to play that into the narrative. The way he frames the characters, the kind of shades he uses for them, and especially when he wants to show the change in her emotions, he uses color to sort of express that. Dil De Chuke Sanam, I think the use of color is definitely more vibrant in comparison to Khamoshi. In the earlier part of the film, especially when he's showing how their romance is sort of building and how they're sort of getting to know each other, they're falling in love with each other. There's a lot of playfulness in it, and he uses blues and greens and yellows and all of these really vibrant sort of colors to sort of present how they're, young and youthful. I also like the fact that her hair becomes this way of sort of telling her feelings, her emotions as a woman, because in the first part of the film, it's always in a long plaid, she's casually flicking it about, it's kind of like, there's this nonchalance about it, and whereas after she's married, it's in this tight bun, and there is little to no color on her, and she uses these very muted kind of shades. It's always like reds and whites and blacks, and she's always like draped with a shawl. It's a very interior kind of an experience, is what I felt.
Saawariya, which is an adaptation of Dostoevsky's White Nights, delves deeper into how Bhansali started using color theory a little bit more in his films.
Ranbir Raj's one-sided love for Sakina takes place in a town where it's nearly always night. It's filled with shades of emerald blue and green, which are the colors of the peacock. Other colors such as reds and purples are provided by the sex work of Gulabu. Now, Saawariya, of course, is set in a fantastical place that exists only in the filmmaker's imagination. It's not meant to be real. The color scheme, the lighting, the grandiose and anachronistic sets are all meant to create a sense of timelessness and otherworldliness.
The figure of Raj, he's an outsider to that particular town. He's not from that town. So he stands out really very clearly, very dominantly from the background. He's also dressed in complete opposition to everything else. If the setting is blue and everyone else's clothes are roughly of that color scheme, he's in red. And he carries a guitar, he carries a football, something so out of the ordinary, alright, so that it makes him stand out. Gulabji is the only other person who stands out from the background because of the clothes she wears. It obviously represents her profession, and she's also the sutradhar of the story.
Now, while we've discussed a lot of Bhansali's earlier works, his last 3 films have the use of color way more, and it's easy to group them together and understand why.
Bhansali's move towards period dramas in his last 2 films has allowed him to experiment with colors in other ways. In Bajirao Mastani, for instance, the courtesan Mastani is dressed in soft pastels and shades of white to emphasize her purity, but also her difference from her lover's wife. Kashibai wears the bright and confident colors of the woman of the household. In Padmavati is initially seen in pastel shades. When she marries into a Rajput household, she is bedecked in reds and gold. By contrast, her tormentor, Alauddin Khilji, is nearly always in earthy shades, in browns and blacks. Padmavati's world is brightly illuminated. Alauddin's kingdom is full of shadows and darkness to underline his exaggerated evilness.
Like the tonality definitely changes in the last 3 movies, and there's something very Indian, very, very traditional being represented in the colors being used. With Ram Leela, it was the bright, vibrant version that people believe India to be. That's what sort of gets represented. Is also definitely a little more garish. The idea that being that, we're loud, we're garrulous, we are over-expressive about everything. And then you have Bajirao that sort of mutes the whole thing. And even with Padmaavat, each character is given a certain kind of backdrop. She's given the forest backdrop. Khilji has this imposing sandstone kind of building behind him. It's a very open kind of space. There's nothing really there. It's almost as if, this is just a makeshift stage right now. There's something more that has to come, as opposed to say how Maharaval Ratan's portrayal is fixed about the way he's represented. There's something very unchanging about the way he's represented. Someone who holds age-old traditions very closely.
His last 3 films almost stand as pseudo-sequels to one another, where of course Deepika and Ranveer are center stage in all 3 of them, but there also seems to be more of a focus on masculine energy as opposed to his earlier works.
I think one of the most fascinating motives that I found in Ram Leela was that when you have the male protagonist entry, and this is unique for I think Ram Leela and probably even the other 2 films, is that that's the first time that Bhansali is actually given the male protagonist such a large opening. The male protagonist never really gets such a large opening in any of his previous movies. And when he's dancing, if you notice, since he is named Ram, the walls also have the figure of Ram in the warrior pose. So this idea of the masculine is really represented. I feel the last 3 movies, probably why they become a little more louder public space is also it's Indian masculinity, it's machismo on display there. There's so much male valor out there for everyone to see. Even if it is Bajirao, he's definitely a more understated character than say Ram from Ram Leela. But even there is this, the male power that really sort of emanates from his representation.
Bhansali is one of the few filmmakers in the Bombay film industry who is very much wedded to the big screen experience. He's a very old-fashioned filmmaker. He's almost like a filmmaker from the 40s or the 50s. He prefers sets to outdoor locations because he can build his world and construct his vision to the last detail. And I think that impulse, which you see in a lot of very much older films, whether here or made in the West, they demand to be watched and consumed on a big screen. When Bhansali creates these worlds, when he constructs these artificial worlds, he does make sure that the rest of his filmmaking techniques are in consonance with this. The whole feel is one of being transported into some other universe. Almost in a way in which Hollywood rolls out these Marvel superhero films where they create these alternate realities. I think Bhansali's films are also in a way sort of alternate realities, and his audiences know and understand that. And that's the reason so many of his films remain very popular.
I think he's someone who's very aware of the history of Indian cinema because he's well versed in the performative traditions of the country. That's his storytelling technique. He wants to use what you associate Indian cinema with and without having to delve only into dialogue. Why can't the subtle changes of color and the setting, the space also tell the story? I think he's definitely someone who's inspired by literature as well as theatre, painting, and well, most performance arts.
Much like films like The Matrix or literally any Wes Anderson film, Bhansali tries to use hue the most to try and depict the tonality of the overall film. And whether you think that Bhansali uses color and settings to push emotions, you can't help but agree that his films always radiate beauty and often stay with you long after you've left the theatre.